Hey, I'm Nikki, the obsessive bookseller. Today, I'm doing a book review. A Time of Dread by John Gwynne of Blood and Bone. It's book one in his follow-up trilogy to Faithful and the Fallen. Faithful and the Fallen was an experience, unlike anything I've ever read before. It was a very classic feeling fantasy written with a more modern tone and definitely written with a more modern, like grimdarky type of feel. Maybe not grimdark per se, but definitely a brutal setting. Nobody's safe. And it gives that feeling of high stakes throughout the entire thing that's really exciting to read. And I love this author's writing style, his ability to create amazing pacing within each chapter. And it's especially good because he does it with multiple POVs. Like in Faithful and the Fallen, like over 15 POVs, I think, at one point. Like, how do you not lose momentum? You be John Gwynne. That's how. Now, he brought a lot of those same elements to this story, but to a lesser degree. I feel like this one's a lot more accessible. It's got a lot fewer characters, and the conflict is a little less complicated. Like, you really know all the cards on the table at once. Or at least I feel like I do compared to the first one. And it gets to the main conflict a lot quicker as well. Initially, I really like the idea that he took from the end of that first series and what the conflict we're dealing with now is. It was a creative way to take kind of black and white thinking and give it some gray area, and I think it can sustain an entire trilogy. Like I said, a lot fewer characters, and a lot of them are younger. So, in a sense, this kind of feels like a YA version of Faithful and the Fallen to me. Just a little bit. And not in any way that's negative, but in a way that it feels younger, it feels fresh, it feels more accessible, and it's definitely not as complicated. Aside from the, brutality. Take that out and you got a YA book. Leave it in and you're like, oh, okay. And even though the characters were younger, I did really like them a lot. They're all kind of fiery, and they've got this drive, and they're not afraid to do hard things. And I love characters that kind of create their own destiny. And two of the three, at least, are really good in that regard. I think the longer I'm with them in this trilogy, the more I'll feel connected to them. But that is one of the things I'm lacking a little bit. And I don't know if it's necessarily this book, or if it's because I just finished Faithful and the Fallen, and I felt so connected to all those characters. And then to not be with them anymore, it could be a little of that. It could be like, well, these are good, but they're not them. The jury is still out. I'm going to try to not go into the second book quite as cranky, because overall, there's nothing that he's doing here that isn't right. It's just not the same. But where does that leave me with rating? So it deserves probably a 4 out of 5 stars. Had I not read any other Gwynne, that's probably what I would have rated it. But I've read most of the other Gwynnes. So Faithful and the Fallen, especially Ruin, was a solid 5-star. Everything else was a 4-star. Bloodsworn, the first book in that one, 4.5 stars. Like, I really love that one. So by comparison, this was my least favorite Gwynne that I've read so far. So I'm coming in at a 3-star. Even though it's a little bit better than that. Maybe a 3.5. But you know those kind of authors where whatever you get from them is just so high quality that, like, if you're comparing them to themselves, it's a lower rating, but if you're comparing them to everything else on the market, it's probably a bit higher. That's where I'm at with this. But do not pick this one up unless you've read the first 4 books, Faithful and the Fallen, unless you don't plan on reading those, because this is spoilers galore. It's basically taking the aftermath of that and creating a new conflict with it, so you get all of the dirty laundry. There you have it. So let's talk about other books you might like. The type of character profiles in this one, the feel of the story, and the types of creatures we're talking about in this one remind me a little bit of The Wayfarer Redemption by Sarah Douglas. This is like a 6-book series, but it continues on into a bunch of spin-off trilogies. I think as far as mood and atmosphere goes, it's similar. This one was a little brutal, but this one's a bit hokier than Gwynne. Gwynne doesn't do hokey. He's like really serious, like really good stuff. But yeah, Sarah Douglas has her own type of style. It's very evident the more you read, and you just kind of got to go with it on occasion. But as far as atmosphere, I think they're a pretty good comparison. The Summer Dragon by Todd Lockwood. This is book 1 in a series that I don't think has a continuation yet. And actually, I kind of struggled with the end half of it for various reasons. But I don't hold that against the book. I think it's very similar to the John Gwynne in the sense of, like, the villains, the overall feel of it, the moodiness, the kind of cold atmosphere, a lot of similarities, and I think both books do really well as being accessible for readers jumping from YA to fantasy. Like, it's a really good transition series because there's not too much to handle, but it's also fun enough. It's got all the classic fantasy elements, so that, like, I liked it. The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie. Technically book 5 in the First Law World. I wouldn't recommend reading them out of order, even though these are, quote, standalones, because I don't feel like they're really standalone-y. Especially when, if you read other ones in the series without having read this one, you'll lose out on all of the, like, depth a character has, whatever. But I love this book, and it gave me similar atmospheric things to Time of Dread, but, like, amped up. The brutal world, kind of unclear good sides and bad sides, which I like. I like the ambiguity there. It's more realistic, and I think it'll give you similar vibes. So if you've read Gwynne but you haven't read Abercrombie, I mean, give him a shot, especially if you can make it to this book here, because it's really good. Child of a Mad God, probably one of my closer recommends on this lineup. It's a Tale of the Coven trilogy. It is part of the whole Corona world that Salvatore created, but they can be read as a standalone. Well, and until you get to book 3, and then you know that there's crap that he's talking about that happened with characters further along, kind of phones it in at that point. But this first book, like, indigenous brutality, but in a fantasy setting with all these different types of people and really cool setting, dark, evil creature, and like, I don't know, like, if you like the bleakest aspects of John Gwynne and you're like, how can we amp it up just even further but still have it be an engaging story, I think Child of a Mad God would be your jam. It was almost a little too gruesome for me in places, but not nearly as bad as I'm sure some others have read. And then finally, if you like John Gwynne, you should try reading more John Gwynne. It's In the Shadow of the Gods. Honestly, if you finish Faithful and the Fallen, where I'm at now is maybe pick up this series and read that and then go back to this one so you're not reading them back to back. I wish I had done that. But he's definitely a writer who's very consistent with the types of stories that he's producing. And I thought Child of a Mad God was phenomenal. It was really good. Kind of hard to get behind the pacing and the characters in the first half. Like, if you're not in it, it might be boring. If you're in it, you're like, give me more of that slow burn ooze off of those pages. I can handle it. I really liked it. Truthfully, if you like Faithful and the Fallen, you've probably already read it. And that wraps up this review. I want to take a minute to thank my patrons. Thank you so much for supporting everything I'm doing. Thank you, Katie, for reading A Time of Dread with me. Special shout out. And I just appreciate all you guys do for my book-loving energy and buddy reads and everything. You just keep me excited to keep producing content, and I love that. Thanks for joining me. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will catch you on the next one. Bye.